Late December 1944, somewhere in the frozen Ardennes. A pale sun hangs low over the snow-choked forests of Belgium. The air hums with silence and broken only by the crackle of distant gunfire. On a narrow, icy road, a small group of German infantrymen huddle near a captured farmhouse, their coats stiff with frost. One of them squints down the valley through binoculars. A convoy is moving, a long, rattling line of American jeeps crawling through the morning fog. Dozens of them, then hundreds. Their engines hum like a swarm of bees lost in the mist. The German soldiers watch half amused. The Americans and their toys, one mutters, shaking his head. They laugh, counting the tiny vehicles bouncing over frozen ruts, unarmored, exposed, absurdly small compared to their own heavy machines. But the laughter fades. The line doesn't end. More headlights appear through the haze. Then more. The road itself seems alive, endless, unstoppable, pouring forward without pause. A cold realization settles in. What they mocked as weakness was something far more dangerous, a machine that never stopped moving. And that, more than any weapon, would decide the war. The year was 1940, Europe burned. Germany's blitzkrieg had torn through Poland and France with terrifying speed. Armored divisions rolling like iron storms across the continent. Every army watching from the outside saw the same thing. The future of warfare was fast, mechanized, and merciless. Across the Atlantic, the United States was still at peace, but only on paper. The War Department, watching the German panzers slice across Europe, understood what few Americans yet realized. The next war would not be fought by horses and foot soldiers. It would be fought by machines. What they needed was mobility. Something small, simple, reliable. A vehicle that could scout, haul, tow, and fight its way across mud, sand, or snow. In the summer of 1940, a request went out to American automobile companies. The specifications were nearly impossible. A four-wheel drive reconnaissance car, under 2,300 pounds, able to carry 600 pounds of gear, and built in just 49 days. Most manufacturers didn't even try. Only three did: Bantam, Willys Overland, and Ford. Bantam produced the first prototype, the BRC, but it was Willys that perfected the design. Their model, the Willys MB, was strong, fast, and cheap to build. It didn't look like much, just a box on wheels with canvas seats and a flat grille. But beneath that simplicity was genius: rugged suspension, a powerful Go Devil engine, and a frame so versatile it could be repaired in the field with a wrench and a hammer. By 1941, as the United States moved closer to war, the Jeep had become more than a prototype. It was a symbol of American adaptability. The Army ordered thousands. By 1942, factories in Toledo and Dearborn were churning them out at a rate the world had never seen. Germany's officers watched these developments with detached amusement. To them, the Wehrmacht's motor pool was the pinnacle of modern warfare. Panzers, half-tracks, and armored cars designed for shock and awe. The American Jeep, by contrast, looked like a toy. A soldier's plaything, not a soldier's weapon. Even within the U.S. ranks, there were skeptics. Some commanders doubted the little machine could survive the brutality of the European front. Yet those doubts faded the moment the first convoys rolled across North Africa. In 1942, the desert sun blazed over Libya and Tunisia as Allied columns surged forward. The jeeps led the way, bouncing over dunes, ferrying officers, carrying radios, hauling wounded men back from the front. The British Eighth Army called them the best friend a soldier ever had. To the Germans facing them, however, it was still hard to take them seriously. They mocked them in reports and propaganda leaflets, tin boxes with wheels. But as those boxes began appearing in every battle theater, from El Alamein to Sicily, the pattern became harder to ignore. The Americans were doing something no army in history had ever done, making movement itself a weapon. And the Jeep was the heart of it. The Germans would soon learn that underestimating it, and the vast machine that built it, was a mistake they could never undo. By 1943, the Jeep was no longer an experiment, it was everywhere. In the dust of Tunisia, in the rubble of Palermo, on the winding roads of Italy. Wherever the Allied armies advanced, the small square silhouette of the Willys MB was never far behind. It carried generals and privates alike. General Eisenhower would later call it one of the three decisive weapons of the war, alongside the C-47 transport and the landing craft. It wasn't built to kill. It was built to keep the war moving. Everywhere it went, it carried the same message. The United States could move faster, farther, and longer than anyone else. From the shores of Sicily to the mountains of Monte Cassino, convoys of jeeps formed a moving web of supply. They carried ammunition to frontline gunners, hot food to freezing outposts, and messages faster than any radio network could manage. Mechanics called them indestructible. Drivers called them loyal. The Germans, observing from the other side, saw something they couldn't quite classify. In reports sent to Berlin, field officers described a strange culture of mobility. Americans who lived on wheels, who built roads faster than bombs could destroy them. They joked about it, but the tone changed as 1944 approached. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the first vehicles to roll off the beaches weren't tanks. They were jeeps. Canvas tops flapping in the sea wind, their engines sputtering through salt and sand. They raced inland before the beaches were even secure. Some were towing small artillery pieces. Others were packed with stretchers and medics. The jeep had become the connective tissue of the Allied invasion. By August, as the breakout from Normandy began, the roads of France transformed into rivers of motion. Jeep convoys flowed in both directions, supplies forward, wounded men back. They passed through shattered villages, muddy hedgerows, and newly liberated towns where children waved as if greeting a parade. To the Germans retreating eastward, it seemed impossible. Their own divisions, bled dry of fuel and spares, could barely move. Tanks sat abandoned on the roadside, their engines silent. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed to have endless reserves, endless vehicles, endless men. Behind every advancing tank column, there were jeeps. Behind every field headquarters, a cluster of jeeps idled, waiting. They carried messages, commanders, medics, maps, even portable kitchens. There were jeeps modified for snow, for radio transmission, for mounting machine guns. Some had armor welded crudely to their sides. Others hauled trailers or water tanks. It was mobility on an industrial scale, the embodiment of the American war machine. German intelligence officers, reading intercepted reports, began to notice something unsettling. No matter how many convoys were bombed, strafed, or ambushed, they kept reforming. Destroy one column and another appeared hours later. It was as if the Americans had endless roads, endless fuel, endless machines. By late 1944, the jeep had become the symbol of that momentum, of a war fought not just with weapons but with wheels. And yet, in the frozen hills of the Ardennes, the Germans still believed they could break it. They thought they could crush the rhythm of American logistics, sever the arteries that fed the front, and prove that the Wehrmacht still controlled the pace of battle. In December 1944, they launched their last great gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. And as the snow fell and roads froze, those same German soldiers once again saw lines of American jeeps stretching through the mist. They laughed at first, but before the month was over, they would learn what it meant to face an army that never stopped coming. In a war defined by complexity, massive tanks, advanced artillery, and coded communications, the jeep stood as an engineering paradox. The simplest machine on the battlefield was also one of the most effective. Its beauty lay in what it didn't have. No armor, no turret, no heavy engine. Just a 60-horsepower Willys Go Devil engine, leaf spring suspension, and a steel body so flat that it could be stacked in shipping crates for transport. Soldiers could disassemble and reassemble it in hours. Its parts were interchangeable. A jeep built in Toledo could be repaired with a part from one built in Dearborn or Dallas. In wartime, that meant life or death. Each jeep could run on low-grade fuel, haul half a ton, and climb 45-degree slopes. It could cross rivers, mud, and snow, with a ground clearance that seemed almost impossible for such a small frame. In North Africa, British mechanics nicknamed it the Mountain Goat. In Italy, it became the Mule. On the Eastern Front, Soviet drivers called it the Little Miracle. But the Germans had no equivalent. Their light vehicles, like the Kübelwagen, were reliable but not as rugged. Built for European roads, not the broken terrain of global war. The Jeep, by contrast, thrived where roads didn't exist. It was not a product of luxury. It was a tool of necessity, engineered by a nation that mass-produced reliability. In that sense, the Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was a philosophy. Mobility for every man at every moment. Every war has its visible weapons. The tanks that crush, the planes that roar, the artillery that shatters. But wars are won by what you don't see. Food, fuel, ammunition, and the ability to deliver them faster than the enemy can destroy them. In that invisible contest, the Jeep was indispensable. It was the messenger of the Allied supply chain, the link between the mighty depots in Normandy and the riflemen at the front. Where trucks stopped, Jeeps carried on. They hauled crates of rations over muddy tracks, towed 37mm anti-tank guns through ruined villages, and ferried medics into the smoke of battle. A single Jeep could deliver supplies to outposts that even Sherman tanks couldn't reach. In some cases, when bridges were destroyed, Jeeps were pushed across rivers on makeshift rafts, or simply driven through the water. The vehicle's very abundance became a weapon. The U.S. produced over 640,000 Jeeps during the war, more than all German armored vehicles combined. That production translated into something more profound: momentum. No matter where the front line moved, the Americans could keep it alive. Their roads pulsed with motion: convoys, columns, ambulances, repair crews, engineers. The sound of the Jeep's small engine became the heartbeat of the Allied advance. To the Wehrmacht, it was an alien form of warfare. German divisions relied on rail lines and horse-drawn carts. When fuel ran short, their panzers froze in place. The Americans, by contrast, treated distance as a temporary inconvenience. The Jeep was everywhere, and that meant the war itself was everywhere, a tide that couldn't be held back. In the early stages of the war, the German army had owned the idea of speed. The Blitzkrieg was lightning warfare, fast, coordinated, ruthless. But by 1944, that lightning had met a storm of machinery. German soldiers who once mocked the endless Jeep convoys began to experience something unsettling: exhaustion. They would destroy a column one day only to face another the next morning. Same vehicles, same sound. The small four-cylinder engine whining in the distance became a symbol of inevitability. A captured German officer reportedly told Allied interrogators, "You could bomb them, block them, burn their trucks, but the Americans always came back. Always." Psychologists in the Wehrmacht began to note the change. The American army fought with a rhythm, not the rigid, timed strikes of the German machine, but a continuous pulse of motion. Soldiers and supplies flowed as one organism, and at the smallest scale of that movement sat the Jeep, the humble courier, the lifeline, the face of modern warfare's relentlessness. Even Allied troops felt it. Many veterans would later describe the sound of a Jeep's engine as the sound of home, of food arriving, of orders being delivered, of the front still holding. In both armies, it became psychological shorthand. If the Jeeps are running, the war isn't lost. The Jeep was no longer just a tool of war. It was a symbol of endurance. But endurance alone doesn't win battles. The next stage would test whether mobility could survive under fire. That test came in the frozen forests of Belgium, when Germany tried to crush the American system in one final strike. In a traditional sense, the Jeep was not a combat vehicle. It carried no armor, no cannon, and no real protection. But tactically, it gave commanders something even more valuable: speed. From the deserts of Africa to the hedgerows of France, speed became strategy. American officers quickly learned that a fast-moving, lightly equipped vehicle could do what no tank could: scout, coordinate, and react. Reconnaissance units used Jeeps as their eyes and ears, darting ahead of infantry formations, marking minefields, and reporting enemy movements. In the chaos of battle, these small vehicles often determined victory or defeat. They could deliver an order to an isolated platoon minutes before a German counterattack or haul ammunition through terrain that would trap heavier machines. Some units modified their Jeeps with 30 or 50 caliber machine guns, turning them into roving gun platforms. The famous rat patrols of North Africa, for instance, used stripped-down Jeeps to ambush convoys and vanish into the dunes before the enemy could react. In Italy and France, paratroopers used Jeeps dropped by gliders, folding windshields, removing wheels, reassembling them on the ground within minutes of landing. Commanders could then coordinate airborne troops as if they had a full mechanized column behind them. Everywhere they went, these vehicles carried not just soldiers but initiative. They gave small units independence on a way to maneuver, strike, and vanish. For German forces trained in rigid formations and centralized command, that flexibility was maddening. They were fighting an enemy that no longer moved in lines but in swarms, and at the center of that swarm was the Jeep, unpredictable, fast, and always in motion. For the men who rode it, the Jeep wasn't a machine. It was a companion. It carried them through every climate, from Saharan sandstorms to Ardennes blizzards. They trusted it more than most weapons. It could pull a wounded friend out of a minefield, haul rations over shell-cratered roads, or serve as a makeshift ambulance under fire. Soldiers named their Jeeps like old friends. Lil Joe, Betty, Faithful. They painted pin-up art on the hoods, hung helmets on the mirrors, and used the flat fenders as seats, desks, even cooking tables. In war, comfort was a rare commodity. The Jeep gave them something close to it, a feeling of control amid chaos. A GI could travel alone through enemy fire, engine humming like a heartbeat, feeling the weight of the world in that little frame of steel and rubber. When the engine sputtered, he'd fix it with whatever he had, wire, tape, or even his rifle cleaning kit. And when it ran again, he'd smile. Because the Jeep wasn't just a tool, it was proof that something in this world still worked. Even medics felt it. Many Jeeps were fitted with stretchers across the hood and rear, ferrying the wounded from the front lines to field hospitals. It was a grim irony. The same vehicle that delivered men to battle was often the one that carried them home. For countless soldiers, their last sight of the battlefield was through the windshield of a Jeep, a view of smoke, sky, and the promise of safety. That bond between man and machine became part of Allied identity. While German soldiers saw their tanks as the embodiment of strength, American troops saw their Jeeps as the embodiment of persistence. The Wehrmacht had long prided itself on engineering superiority. Its tanks were masterpieces of precision, its trucks and half-tracks meticulously designed. In contrast, the American Jeep looked crude, almost careless. Early German field reports from 1942 and 1943 mocked it openly. The Americans drive children's cars. One officer wrote after observing Allied patrols in North Africa. But that perception began to shift as the war dragged on. German intelligence analysts started to notice how the Allies moved, not in concentrated, slow-moving columns, but in thousands of independent units, each capable of acting without waiting for orders. The Jeep made that possible. Captured Jeeps were often studied by Wehrmacht engineers. They were puzzled by the simplicity, the interchangeable parts, the easy maintenance. One German officer reportedly remarked, "It is the opposite of our design philosophy. We make machines that cannot fail. They make machines that can be fixed when they do." By 1944, the tone had changed entirely. Reports from the Eastern Front and Italy began warning of the American vehicle advantage, endless convoys that could rebuild shattered positions in days. And during the Battle of the Bulge, as German panzers tried to slice through Allied lines, they found those same Jeeps everywhere, ferrying ammunition through the snow, dragging artillery shells across broken roads, weaving between stalled tanks. The same officers who once laughed now stared in disbelief. They began to understand that the war was no longer about who had the best machines, but who had the most movement. And in that measure, the Jeep was unbeatable. By the winter of 1944, the stage was set for the greatest test of that endurance. The frozen forests of the Ardennes would see the clash of two visions of war. One built on precision and armor, the other on motion and supply. The Germans believed they could finally stop the convoys, but the convoys never stopped. December 16, 1944. Before dawn, the forests of the Ardennes exploded with artillery fire. The snow-covered ridges trembled under the weight of over 2,600 German guns, hurling shells into American lines stretching from Monschau to Luxembourg. For 6 months, the Allies had been advancing east, confident, relentless, seemingly unstoppable. Then, in one night, the Germans struck back with brutal precision. It was Hitler's last gamble. The Ardennes offensive, what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge. His goal was simple but desperate: punch through the thinly held American front, capture Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two, and force a negotiated peace before Germany collapsed. The surprise was total. American units, many resting, refitting, or newly arrived, were thrown into chaos. Roads clogged with snow and confusion. Convoys burned under strafing runs. Supply columns were ambushed and cut apart. For the first time since D-Day, American momentum faltered. German panzers, the 5th and 6th Panzer armies, surged forward under cover of fog, smashing through small towns like St. Vith and Clairvaux. Their Tiger and Panther tanks prowled the White Hills, while paratroopers infiltrated crossroads disguised in captured uniforms. And as German commanders watched the Americans retreat, they mocked once again. Reports described abandoned jeeps littering the roadsides, frozen in place, wheels sunk in snow. "The Americans cannot fight without their cars," one officer radioed on December 17th. For a moment it seemed true. The weather grounded Allied aircraft, the lifeblood of their mobility. Fuel convoys were trapped behind blown bridges. The supply network, the very heart of the American war effort, appeared to be breaking. In places like Bastogne, entire divisions were surrounded. The 101st Airborne held their ground, but their link to the outside world was a single narrow road, clogged with snow, under artillery fire, and choked with wreckage. That road was lined with jeeps, many destroyed, many still trying to move. Their engines sputtered in the cold, tires slipping on ice. Soldiers used them as ambulances, barricades, even makeshift gun platforms. But even in disaster, the rhythm never fully stopped. Behind the collapsing front, American engineers and drivers fought a different kind of battle. Not with bullets, but with wheels. They dug out roads, towed stuck vehicles, and formed new routes through forests and frozen rivers. The Germans, advancing fast, began to run into a strange problem. The enemy wouldn't stop retreating, but they also wouldn't disappear. Everywhere they pushed, new convoys appeared. Jeeps, trucks, ambulances, regrouping, redirecting, reorganizing. By December 20th, the fog began to lift. Allied command, under Eisenhower and Bradley, started to reimpose order. Reinforcements poured in from the north and south. Thousands of jeeps carried officers coordinating counterattacks, fuel for tanks and medical supplies for encircled towns. The front was no longer collapsing, and it was bending, reshaping, absorbing the blow. Meanwhile, German fuel reserves began to vanish. Their offensive had burned faster than expected. Capturing Allied fuel dumps was essential to keep moving. But those dumps were always one step ahead, evacuated by endless streams of American vehicles. A German panzer commander later wrote, "We did not just fight the enemy. We fought his movement. We fought the roads themselves." By Christmas Eve, that movement was back in full force. From the air, reconnaissance pilots reported roads glowing like silver threads across the Ardennes, headlights stretching for miles, snaking through the snow. The Germans had hoped to freeze the American war machine in place. Instead, they had awakened it. In the frozen silence of the Ardennes, the sound of engines began again, low, steady, and endless. The German attack was still raging, but its momentum was fading fast. The Wehrmacht was about to face something it had never encountered before, an army that could rebuild itself in the middle of battle. By December 22, 1944, the Ardennes offensive had reached its peak. The German spearheads were closing in on Bastogne, their tanks crawling through snow like armored beasts. For days, the fog refused to lift. Allied bombers sat grounded, and American soldiers fought blind in the woods. To the Germans, it seemed victory was within reach. They had trapped the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division inside Bastogne. Every road in and out was cut, and temperatures dropped below freezing. The Americans had little food, less ammunition, and almost no medical supplies. Then, on the night of December 23rd, the skies cleared. The roar of Allied transport planes echoed through the valleys, C-47s dropping supplies by parachute. But what mattered most was what happened on the ground. From every direction, convoys began to move. Jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks, and thousands of them, roared to life across Belgium and Luxembourg. They carried fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Engineers rebuilt bridges in the dark, clearing paths through snowdrifts and bomb craters. And at the head of almost every column leading the way were jeeps, scouting routes marking danger zones, guiding the endless line behind them. It was not elegant warfare. It was raw endurance. At Patton's Third Army headquarters, orders flew through the night. Patton's men, turning north with legendary speed, began the march to relieve Bastogne. His staff recalled that the roads were alive, miles of headlights stretching to the horizon, vehicles slipping and grinding forward without pause. When the 4th Armored Division finally broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, the first vehicles to enter the town were jeeps, medics, signalmen, and supply drivers. Behind them rolled tanks and trucks, but the first sound the trapped soldiers heard was the high, steady whine of the jeep's small engine. One survivor recalled, "It was the sound of the world coming back." Across the Ardennes, the same pattern repeated. Wherever German advances stalled, American logistics surged. Jeeps carried orders to isolated outposts, evacuated wounded men under shell fire, towed artillery through mud and ice. Drivers worked without sleep, headlights blacked out, following convoy ropes through the snow to keep formation. And slowly, mile by mile, the German advance began to collapse. The Wehrmacht had gambled everything on speed, but now their tanks stood still, empty of fuel. Their supply lines, already thin, stretched beyond their limits. American air power returned with a vengeance, bombing columns trapped on narrow forest roads. Captured German diaries tell the story of disbelief. One infantryman wrote, "We destroyed their convoys again and again, but each morning the roads were full once more." The Americans do not know when to stop. By early January 1945, the last German assault had failed. The offensive, meant to split the Allies, instead consumed the last of Germany's reserves. Their panzers froze in the snow, surrounded by armies that moved faster, supplied deeper, and fought longer. From Bastogne to Houffalize, the roads were choked with abandoned German armor, hulks of steel half buried in snow, while American jeeps drove past them in endless streams. The same vehicle that had once been laughed at now represented everything the enemy feared, the unstoppable pulse of American industry. In total, more than 50,000 jeeps operated in the European theater by the end of 1944. They had carried generals and privates, supplies and wounded, radio operators and chaplains. They had turned frozen wilderness into living arteries of war, and as January dawned, those arteries were pushing east again. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last hope, was broken. What remained of the Wehrmacht was in retreat, crushed not just by firepower but by motion itself. The Americans had proved that their greatest weapon wasn't the tank or the bomber. It was the unbroken rhythm of men and machines that never stopped moving. The Germans had tried to freeze that rhythm in the snows of Belgium. But the convoys came anyway. They always came. The Ardennes marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. But for those who fought in that winter, the memory of that endurance, of jeeps crawling through snow and darkness, would define what victory truly meant. When the Ardennes campaign finally ended in late January 1945, the once proud German army was a shadow of its former self. The Battle of the Bulge, as the Allies would later call it, had cost Hitler nearly everything he had left. More than 100,000 German casualties, thousands of tanks and vehicles destroyed, and an irreplaceable loss of fuel and aircraft. The offensive, meant to divide the Allies, had instead united them in purpose. From the air, reconnaissance photos told the story. Endless lines of burnt-out panzers scattered across white fields, frozen in retreat. The bulge on the map that had once pushed westward now folded back on itself, a scar in the snow where Germany's last dream of victory had died. But what fascinated historians in the aftermath wasn't just the scale of the battle. It was the machine that made recovery possible, the American logistical system, and at its heart, the Jeep. In the first week after Bastogne's liberation, more than 15,000 vehicles rolled through the ruined town. Engineers repaired roads within hours, bridging rivers and clearing wreckage. Jeeps led convoys deeper into the forest, carrying survey teams and medics to find survivors. Where German vehicles had stalled or been abandoned, American ones kept running, fueled, supplied, maintained by an endless flow of spare parts and manpower. The contrast was stark. German commanders, interrogated after the battle, spoke with disbelief at how fast the Americans replaced their losses. One officer said, "We destroyed their columns, yet the next day new ones appeared. It was as if they grew from the earth." That illusion of limitless strength was the product of planning and production. The U.S. Army Service Forces had mastered something the Germans never could: synchronized mobility. Every gallon of fuel, every ration, every bullet followed a mathematical rhythm from port to front. And the Jeep, light and reliable, was the connective tissue. Even as the front lines moved eastward, Jeeps carried engineers who mapped destroyed bridges, officers who coordinated supply dumps, and soldiers who guided armor through the battered Belgian villages. It was said that wherever an American unit stood, a Jeep wasn't far away. For the men who drove them, the vehicle was more than transport. It was survival. In snowstorms, they wrapped themselves in blankets and kept the engine running just to stay alive. In thawing mud, They dug out by hand, pushing their machines forward when trucks and tanks bogged down. To the Germans, this small, tireless machine had become an emblem of defeat, proof that the Americans could absorb punishment and still keep advancing. To the Allies, it became the face of victory, a reminder that speed, coordination, and willpower could overcome even the most brutal winter. By February 1945, the roads of Belgium were clear again. The wreckage had been pushed aside. The convoys rolled east and entered toward the Rhine, and on every road leading the way the same sound echoed once more, the steady hum of thousands of small engines, pushing history toward Berlin. The Jeep had done more than survive the Ardennes. It had carried an army through it. By March 1945, the Allies stood on the western banks of the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The Ardennes offensive had failed so completely that its consequences echoed through every level of the German command. The Wehrmacht no longer had reserves. Their panzer divisions were burned out, their fuel depots empty, their supply routes shattered. Every mile eastward, American and British convoys followed behind the retreating front. Endless lines of trucks, tank transporters, and the ever-present jeeps guiding the advance. The Jeep had become the war's bloodstream. It ferried generals to the front, carried engineers to new crossings, and brought field reporters who recorded the collapse of the Reich in real time. When Allied units reached the Remagen Bridge on March 7, 1945, and discovered it still standing, it was again jeeps that first crossed, packed with scouts and signalmen who rushed to secure the eastern bank before the Germans could demolish it. Photographs from those days capture the moment perfectly. Jeeps racing across the damaged bridge, smoke curling from the girders, soldiers crouched low as sniper fire crackled from the far side. Small, exposed, and fast, the same machine that had once been mocked for its fragility was now leading the charge into the enemy's homeland. To the soldiers, it felt almost poetic. This wasn't about steel superiority anymore. It was about motion, about refusing to stop. The U.S. First and Third Armies advanced with breathtaking speed. From the Rhine to the Elbe, the distance that had taken Germany years to conquer was erased in weeks. And every division's advance map showed the same pattern. A forward command jeep, a signal jeep, a medical jeep, and a reconnaissance jeep, always out front. In destroyed German towns, civilians saw the first sign of the New World not as a tank or bomber, but as a small, dust-covered jeep pulling up their street, an American flag painted on its hood. To them it was the sound of occupation and liberation. The German High Command, reviewing reports from the front, came to a grim understanding. Their own army had been paralyzed by dependence on heavy machinery that could no longer move. The Americans had built the opposite, an army of motion where every soldier, no matter his role, was connected to the fight by wheels and willpower. Even after victory, the Jeep's story didn't end. By the summer of 1945, Allied occupation forces across Europe relied on them for patrols, medical work, and rebuilding efforts. They became part of the landscape, scattered across ruined cities, climbing mountain passes, ferrying diplomats and refugees alike. Some remained in service for decades. Others were given to civilians, beginning new lives as farm vehicles or rescue transports. The German officers who had once laughed at them now called them the soldier's horse, an acknowledgement that warfare itself had changed. The Jeep had shown that strength was not measured only in armor or firepower, but in persistence, the ability to keep moving when everything else stopped. In the grand sweep of World War II, it was just one vehicle among millions, but it represented something greater, the heartbeat of modern warfare, the embodiment of mobility and determination that no empire could halt. As spring came to Europe in 1945, the roads that had once echoed with gunfire were filled with the rattle of engines and the shouts of victory. The war's end was near, and the same little machines that had carried men through chaos now carried them home. The war that began with tanks, bombers, and battleships ended with something smaller, a simple four-wheeled machine that carried men through it all. The Jeep was never designed to be glorious. It didn't roar like a tank or soar like a plane. It was light, exposed, and ordinary. Yet it became the most recognizable face of the Allied advance, a symbol of motion in a war that had frozen so many lives still. To the men who drove them, the Jeep was freedom. It carried them across rivers, through forests, over bombed-out roads, and through towns that no longer existed. It carried the wounded, the weary, and the commanders who shaped history. It became, in every sense, the connective tissue of the Allied armies. For the Germans, it revealed a truth they could never match, that the real strength of America was not its weapons, but its capacity to keep moving. The Jeep embodied that rhythm, cheap to build, easy to repair, endlessly available. It turned logistics into strategy, turning roads into arteries of power. In the aftermath, when Europe was a continent of ruins, Jeeps rolled through the silence once more, carrying doctors, engineers, and relief workers. The same machine that had led men to war now helped rebuild what the war had destroyed. And in time, the image of the Jeep outlasted the empires it fought. It became a universal emblem of endurance, of motion, of the ordinary soldier's quiet courage. When historians look back on World War II, they often speak of grand battles and powerful leaders. But sometimes history turns on smaller things, on engines that refused to stall, on wheels that kept turning through mud and snow. The Germans mocked the little American Jeeps because they seemed fragile. But fragility, when multiplied by millions, became unstoppable. In the end, that was the lesson of the war itself, that resilience, not might, decides the fate of nations. And somewhere in that frozen winter of 1944, amid the echo of engines that never stopped coming, the world learned what endurance truly meant.